Now, I'm a geographer and I love maps. And I think this is a particularly nice map, which dates to 1895, so it's not really that long ago. And even then, the Arctic was an unknown region. While that's not the case today, what is still the case is that the Arctic is a very challenging region for scientists to work within. There are vast differences, vast distances, there are challenging climatic conditions, multiple jurisdictions. And of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has complicated this picture even further, whereby scientists' abilities to understand what's happening across the circumpolar world has been limited, with all of the restrictions now in place on working and coordinating or cooperating with Russian scientists or entities. And that in itself hinders our ability to be able to more accurately forecast what's happening with regards to climate change and how that might affect not just the Arctic, but other areas in the world. And another map. And this red line here shows the operational boundary that the Arctic Council uses for its biodiversity related activities. It's a huge area, covers something like 32 million square kilometers. So it just gives you an idea of the vast distances and the areas in question. And that little red dot, that's where I'm sitting now in Akureyri in the north of Iceland. So perhaps the key challenge that we face in this huge area is how do we shorten the time between detection and response? In other words, how do we, as soon as we detect some changes that may have an impact climatically, on ecosystems, on biodiversity, and how do we detect that and then in a relatively short enough time assess it and come with suggested management or scientific advice or recommendations to decision makers? So how do we shorten the time between detect something and we're able to respond appropriately? So that's the key challenge, I think, in this huge area. I mentioned the Arctic Council earlier, and that's, as I said, where I worked for many years. And this is the primary intergovernmental forum in the Arctic. And it's the main body whereby both Arctic and non-Arctic states come together to discuss issues of common concern when it comes to Arctic issues. Uh, it's a unique organization in many ways in that you have 8 Arctic states, the Nordic states, Canada, the US, and of course Russia. But you also have the indigenous organizations who are known as permanent participants, and there are 6 of them. And they have a seat at the table with the Arctic states. They don't have voting rights, as the Arctic Council is a consensus-based decision-making body, but all decisions that the Council may come to, they're obliged to consult with the indigenous people organizations before those decisions are taken. So it means that they have a very good position in which to influence the work of the council and what it does. And they've been hugely influential in helping determine the direction that the council takes when it comes to biodiversity monitoring, for example, and other issues. Uh, you have a whole range then of non-Arctic states which also participate in the Arctic Council from Europe, from Asia, and elsewhere. And they're observer states because they observe. They're allowed to participate in scientific work in the council, but they don't have any sort of say or voice when it comes to decision making or discussing issues with relation to policy. Uh, and this map here shows you all the member states in blue of the Arctic Council, and then it shows you those observer states. You have that group of European states that have been members to the Arctic Council for many years. More recently, other European states, such as Ireland, have applied for membership, but that hasn't yet been successful. And then you have a group in Asia of more recent observer states where you have China, you have India, you have the Republic of Korea, you have Japan, and you have Singapore. Now, all of these states have an interest in Arctic issues, both economic and environmental. For example, in the case of Singapore, one of the world's larger shipping states, the shortening of shipping routes due to melting sea ice in the Arctic has a direct impact upon their economy. So as a result, they're interested in what happens there. Of course, a big challenge when it comes to managing Arctic issues is, at least in the context of the Arctic Council, is how long powers such as India or China will be content to be observers to the Council, just contributing on science issues, while the other Arctic states say, this is our backyard, we decide what happens here. So that's a distinct tug of war that's been made even more complex by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, whereby Russia works with other interested Arctic states, and it's a challenging process at the moment, and it's going to be really interesting to see how that develops in the coming years. And even with the recent election of Trump in the US and his denial of climate change the last time that he was president, what impact will that have on these types of cooperation? Now, the Arctic Council as an entity has, by and large, managed to escape a lot of the geopolitical forces that have been at play throughout the Cold War and others. And even though it was Russia that originally proposed the establishment of what ultimately became the Arctic Council. But I think now that time is gone, and it's no longer an exception to the rule, and we begin to see very challenging processes at work. And all of this bites down upon science and our understanding of what's happening in the Arctic, and our ability to see, okay, what will happen here? How will it affect other people? What's happening with ocean acidification? What's happening with melting glaciers in Greenland? All of these things, they're of common universal concern. And now our inability to access all of the Arctic to properly understand the status and trends that are happening is becoming ever more challenging. But those challenges aside, what the Arctic Council has put into place over the last number of years is a process whereby it has established a circumpolar biodiversity monitoring program whose task or whose goal is to monitor changes happening in the Arctic, assess those changes, and then produce recommendations that go to the Arctic states and non-Arctic states and other relevant parties on what might be done in response to those changes. So in 2013, the Arctic Council produced the first ever circumpolar assessment of the status and trends of Arctic biodiversity. There were several hundred scientists and indigenous experts involved in that great undertaking, and it produced for the first time a baseline of existing knowledge, so we could see where there are gaps in our knowledge, we could see where there were trends beginning to happen, and it helped to focus our attention on where we should monitor, where we should pay more attention to. And as the Arctic Council produced this remarkable report, they also developed what is known as the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program, the CBMP. And the purpose of this monitoring program is to act as the engine that drives that baseline produced in the Arctic Biodiversity Assessment forward, so that it can help us produce quicker, more agile and more direct or focused assessments as we try and see where trends are having an impact or where changes might be happening. The way that they devised this monitoring program is that after many years of discussion with scientists across the Arctic and with scientists from outside the Arctic and with indigenous peoples, they identified a series of what they call focal ecosystem components in each of the 4 ecosystem types: freshwater, terrestrial, monitoring, and coastal. And the idea being that if there was a change in the status and trends of a particular focal ecosystem component, and that indicated something was at work and perhaps we needed to pay closer attention to it. And it was through assessing and monitoring and assessing these types of ecosystem components that we would then develop a series of more targeted, focused assessments to try and understand what we're seeing on the ground. And based upon those assessments, then to deliver recommendations and advice to Arctic states and others on actions that might be taken in response. These 4 ecosystem plans were developed sequentially, so one after the other, and the most recent plan developed has been that of the Coastal Ecosystem Monitoring Plan, and that is the first platform for co-production of knowledge that has been delivered by the Arctic Council. And what I mean by co-production is that's where we worked with scientists and indigenous experts and representatives to try and look at each of these focal ecosystem components, identify them, and also identify what were the scientific attributes for a component and what were the indigenous attributes that we needed to track. So, for example, you could be looking at taste, smell, hunting issues, a whole range of different things that would not be covered by traditional Western science. And it makes it much easier for us when it is implemented, to try and have a better, more sort of comprehensive look at what's happening in the Arctic, where we're making the most we can out of two different knowledge types, indigenous knowledge and traditional science. And that plan is in the process of being implemented at the moment and is working towards developing its first State of the Coastal Biodiversity Arctic report, which hopefully will come in the next year or so. And here is that plan that I forgot I had a slide for. This diagram here gives you an example of some of the ways in which we're trying to condense these often very dense, complex scientific reports into easy to understand, uncomplicated infographics, in this case, are ways to try and transfer information to bureaucrats who are making decisions on Arctic issues and who may not necessarily have the training or the ability to understand the science behind what's being proposed to them. In this case, this diagram shows the status and trends of focal ecosystem components in the Arctic's marine ecosystems. So the way it's structured is that each segment of this pie, of this circle, represents a specific Arctic marine area that's unique with different characteristics, and each concentric circle represents one of these focal ecosystem components. So you have lots of seals, you have polar bears, and so on. And it gives you a very good, quick understanding of where we do have knowledge, where we don't have knowledge. For example, in the Kara-Laptev Sea, it seems that we don't know anything. And that's not because necessarily that there is no science or monitoring going on there. It's just that perhaps we're unable to access that knowledge, perhaps due to Russian language issues or whatever the case might be. And it helps us to focus, perhaps future research and funding and monitoring programs to say, okay, we need to understand better what's happening there. Why are we not able to gather the information? What's hindering our ability to access that? So the intention is that these type of diagrams help give decision and policymakers a quick understanding of where we have knowledge, where we don't have knowledge, and some of the trends that these things might be telling us. So for example, if you look at the inner circle, which is narwhal, you'll see 5 green circles indicating that their populations are increasing. Which sounds great, but when we looked a little bit closer at it, it's more that those populations are recovering from historical overharvesting. So it's a good story in the sense that they're rebounding, but it's not necessarily a good story in the sense that those populations are increasing enough, or things are as they should be. So this is an idea or an example of some of the types of infographics or ways that we try and produce information to impart quicker and easier understanding. This map here I included, as it always maps, is that I think it shows really nicely how what happens in the Arctic is relevant for many other places in the Arctic, because the examples I've talked about until now have been about monitoring in the Arctic, looking at what's happening to Arctic ecosystems, Arctic biodiversity. But of course, many Arctic biodiversity travels outside of the Arctic, and they spend the winter seasons elsewhere. And this map is a map that was developed as part of what's known as the Arctic Migratory Bird Initiative, whereby we went through a long process to identify birds of conservation concern in the Arctic and looked at what might need to be done to improve their conservation status. And what makes this map really interesting is that it clearly highlights that what happens in the Arctic, for example, if we're trying to conserve a bird that's in danger in the north of Norway, but that bird travels down to India, where perhaps it's hunted or it's harvested or its habitats are being destroyed, or vice versa. Birds travel from Asia up to Russia and they're perhaps hunted there. It just illustrates that our conservation efforts are limited unless we find a way to work together in a more equal footing. And it's a nice example when it comes to Estonia, because Estonia is on the African Eurasian Flyway, so some of these species and birds pass through Estonia. And it's a nice basis from which to try and find ground for common understanding, how we can work together for the greater conservation good. And as you can see that these flyways go across the Arctic, they go down from Russia down to the Yellow Sea, down through the Indian subcontinent, and of course all the way down to South America. And up until relatively recently, CAF had a coordinator based in South America. So the things that happen in the Arctic are relevant elsewhere, and that's one of the challenges that we face. How do we find that way to ensure that cooperation happens smoothly? And the Arctic Council is the primary forum for that, and you see a lot of these non-Arctic states participating in that forum to try and find ways that they can contribute their science and their information into the work that that council is doing. Of course, this infographic here, which was produced with that map, shows that there's a very complex framework of conservation agreements, conservation multilateral environmental agreements that all touch on, for example, in this case, the species that we're looking at. So it is a complex framework out there, and one of our challenges is how do we make sure that all of these different frameworks don't duplicate each other's work, that they interact in a more efficient, effective way. So as I know, this is a very quick run through of different things that we do when it comes to biodiversity monitoring and assessment in the Arctic. And I just wanted to include one final map. And this map shows the areas that are covered by Russia in the Arctic, and it shows the areas that are covered by non-Russian states in the Arctic. And as you can see, at least almost 40% of the Arctic, both marine and terrestrial areas, lie within Russia. And the restrictions on cooperation that we have because of this is that scientists cannot travel there, scientists there cannot impart their information or understanding outside of Russia, means that it's having very significant consequences for our ability to understand changes happening across the Arctic in the near term and in the future. And yeah, it's quite sad. But this picture illustrates very well one of the challenges that we're really facing now when it comes to understanding changes, for example, in these migratory bird species that travel from Russian areas further down to other parts of the world. How we can work together when it comes to looking at marine mammals, migratory pathways, all sorts of things. And that's where I'll maybe stop. And of course, I'm happy to follow up to any questions people might have for me. And I have a very simple email. It's tom@unak.is. And thank you very much for listening to me. And I hope to come to visit Estonia soon and hopefully see much more Estonian interest in Arctic issues, and perhaps begin to see Estonian scientists and experts starting to engage in the Arctic and appearing at many of the meetings that I attend. So thank you and good evening from Akureyri. Bye.